And we will get underway. So welcome everyone to our Delta Think News and Views webinar series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We're happy to see you again. And those of you who are new here, we're glad you were able to join us today. I'm going to start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for us today. I'm joined by my colleagues, Heather Staines, Strategy Consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our Data and Analytics tool, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of the Data and Analytics tool. And if you've joined us for a News and Views webinar before, then you know these are designed to be interactive, lots of questions and participation from you all. So I hope you're ready for a lively and informal discussion. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, if you can ask it in the Q&A box, that would be really helpful. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Heather and Dan to start us off, and then we'll move into a review of the two analytics tools we'll be discussing today, followed by questions and open discussion after we discuss each tool. So we'll present a tool, we'll have a question and answer period, and then we'll present a second tool. So again, thank you for joining us today. I'll hand it off to Heather now to get us started.
Thanks, Lori. It's great to be here today to see familiar names amongst the attendees, but also some new names as well. So thank you for joining. Just a little bit about how we're going to organize our time today. Lori mentioned that we like these to be, relatively informal, but we do have some stuff we want to cover, so we will try to keep things kind of moving along. I want to highlight before we get started that even though we're framing a lot of what we'll show you in terms of OA strategy, that in order to understand your OA strategy, you obviously need to understand a strategy around your non-OA content as well. So think of it as really a comprehensive offering, and not just APC models. We all know there's so many conversations now around new models. We've done some of our news and views around subscribe to Open and Diamond. So think of what we'll be talking about as applicable on a broad basis. First, we're going to talk about the heat map modeling tool, and Dan will be digging into that in more detail. And then we'll take a break to do some questions just around those slides. But we do want to leave a little bit of time towards later in the hour to talk about the affordability calculator, and we've got some questions around that. And I just want to say, if you haven't registered yet for our market sizing webinar, which will happen on October 25th, we're going to be dropping a link in the chat so that you can do that. We'll do it again at the end for anyone who's joined late. So we definitely don't want you to forget about that. You're seeing us twice in the course of a couple months, but we guarantee you that exciting times to be had across those as well. So let me move along. So you may have noticed in our recent news and views in August and September, we dug in more depth into these topics that we'll be talking about today. In August, we focused on affordability. We'll be dealing with that in the sort of second piece of the webinar today, how purchasing power parity plays out across the globe, and how different publisher strategies may take that into account, what might happen. And in the September news and views, we kind of took a little bit of a zoomed out approach to think about questions your organization should ask in times of change. And we did, touch a little bit on projects that we have done, here at Delta Think that caused us to create this heat map or modeling tool. So I'm going to hand over to Dan to kick us off.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you so much for joining us. So, as Heather said, I'll start by diving into some of what we term the heat map tools. This first slide actually isn't a heat map, but we'll come onto those. And as Heather said, we find as we work with publishers or libraries or consortia that quite often, as things out there change, that leads to questions arising of effectively, well, so what? What do I do next? What does that mean for my organization? How might I prioritize things? And we found in the course of trying to answer some of those questions and dig into the kind of next layer of detail that you need beneath them, we've developed just a few ways of visualizing things, and we just hope that by sharing maybe a little bit about what goes on under the hood if you're an American, or under the bonnet if you're in the UK. And I'm sorry, I'm not multilingual, so I don't know the phrase for other languages, but it's a little bit of what we work on sort of behind the scenes and under the surface to run some of our analyses. So we've got four or five slides that just show some typical outputs and typical things about what we do. These are based on sort of real world projects, but of course we can't share that data with you because a lot of what we do is understandably in confidence. So what we've done is the data is fictitious, and we've also needed to come up with some sort of fictitious publisher. And I like going on about the publisher of cheese and wine. So we have some cheese and wine themed fictitious journals for you to sort of illustrate the general principles of how some of this stuff works. So this first screenshot is basically pulled from the kind of interactive tools that we develop to allow people to explore what's happening out there. And the context quite often is if you are thinking, for example, of starting a new journal, perhaps you are reviewing subscriptions to journals or collections of journals, or perhaps you are thinking of saying, well, I publish some journals and I'm now wondering whether or not I should make those journals open or not. And that might be fully open access or offer on some sort of public access policy. So that general sense of there are journals out there, how are they tracking, how compared with how the rest of the world is going? And that's what this gets us to. So what we'll often do is start with, and I'll just dive into the middle chart as a sort of starting point. There's lots going on here, so we'll break it all down. But quite often we first need to find out, well, what's the open access uptake within a journal or across a collection, or it may even be across the market in general. And that's often a good starting point to get a sense of, okay, so, you know, if things are really, really going open, then maybe I need to think more about that. And maybe if they're not going open, then I can leave things as they are. And that's typically the sorts of conversations people have. So what that middle chart shows is how we might break things down. We've got three groups of bars reading top to bottom for our three fictitious journals, which my screen's a little bit small, so I can't read them. But I think it's reading from top to bottom. We've got the Proceedings of Gastronomy, the bottom third. In Vino Veritas is the middle third. And then I think it's the Annals of Cheese are on the top. So there's our sort of three fictitious journals. They could apply to any journal. They could be looking at what you publish, what you subscribe to, sort of depending on whether you're selling or buying, or we can apply this across the whole marketplace. So we can look at across the subject area. But as I said, we thought we'd just take three examples to give you a sense of how we might start to look at this. And then the color coding in the bars is simply saying, well, for a given year, there's one bar per year in that journal. What proportion of that journal's output is fully open access in the gold, the leftmost color, hybrid open access, that's the blue slice second from the left, is public access, or AKA bronze. So that means it's free of charge to read, but doesn't necessarily have a reusable or Creative Commons type license attached. And that's the kind of brown. They're meant to be bronze, but bronze doesn't really work in Excel and PowerPoint. So the second chunk from the right, that's our public access uptake. And then finally the grey bars are on the right of the closed or subscription output. And so what we can see is, for example, the Proceedings of Gastronomy, the journal at the bottom, actually seems to have more than half of its output open in some form. And that's split roughly 50-50 between the bronze, the public access, and the open access, the yellow fully open, or the blue hybrid. But then if you look at the colors in the bars going over time, so we start at 2018 and go through 2025, you can see that the uptake of open access is growing over time. So this sort of visualization is very useful to get a sense of how are things changing? How popular, how useful is open access? And as I said, this fictitious example runs per journal. We can roll these up, as you'll see, by collection or by topic or whatever. The other thing we do, and we find it requires a little bit of heavy lifting behind the scenes, is we'll take historical data. So if you look at the years, they're running 2018 through about 2022, and we're just doing the 2023 data now, but we'll then project that forward. So the last few years are looking kind of 2023 to 2025 in these models, because often people want to know, well, what's the direction of travel, and will uptake continue to increase, or has it hit a peak and is it falling off? So we'll do a little bit of work to try and project things forward. And that's something we think is quite useful. It's not always easy to get that from some of the online tools, because a lot of the online tools you'll normally go to on measuring retrospectively. So that sort of frames things in the middle chart, and then we can start to accelerate as we get into things. If we look at the right chart, it's basically the same stuff, same colors, same breakdown, but the other flip side of all this is, as well as how much happens within a particular journal, you might also want to know how big that journal is, because we've often found there's a trade-off to say, well, you may have something that's very popular, but if there's very, very little of it, it might make very little difference if you make any changes, or vice versa. You might find, for example, the middle group of bars for our In Vino Veritas, our fictitious winemaking journal, it's got perhaps relatively modest amounts of open access uptake if you look at the middle chart compared with the others, but it produces a lot more stuff if you look at the bars on the right hand side. So when we go through analysis like that, it enables people to say, well, where should I prioritize my time? Perhaps in actual fact, I might want to think about making my In Vino Veritas, that middle journal, make that go open access before any of the others, simply because it will end up producing a lot more open access stuff because it publishes more stuff overall. So we find we often need to look at charts in pairs so you can get a sense of how much are things changing in the uptake, and compare that with how much of an effect, how sort of much output those journals might have. And that by bringing those two together, you can then start to think through, okay, so what might this mean for me? Where might my priorities lie? And similarly, if you're a librarian looking at collections or subscriptions, there's no point in negotiating hard and cancelling loads of subs for journals that have tiny proportions of output. You probably won't save a huge amount of money, but you might want to have a conversation with publishers if they're sort of very large journals are beginning to make a shift. You might want to have a conversation about, well, how's that looking in terms of our overall package? So we think this kind of analysis can apply really whatever your perspective, just to get a sense of how are things changing over time. And then one final thing, we've picked 3 journals here. So there's 3 groups of bars working from top to bottom. Of course, in the real world, people are often dealing with many, many more journals. You can have thousands of journals in a collection. A large publisher can publish thousands of journals. Even a relatively small publisher may have a couple of dozen. So if you now imagine these charts, and instead of 3 chunks, you have maybe 20 or 30 or 100 chunks of journals, all of a sudden those bars are going to get really squashed up and get really, really thin. And it may be very, very hard to actually pull out the detail that you need. So if you look on the left-hand side of the chart, that's where we've developed interactive tools. And we often deliver this kind of analysis in the form of a spreadsheet. And those little panels on the left are buttons that you can click on to basically filter the chart to say, well, okay, I might only want to see a particular journal. And if you look at the panel in the middle on the left, you'll see our 3 journals for cheesemaking, or in actual fact, its subject areas: cheesemaking, gastronomy, and oenology. And the point being, if you had many, many more journals on the right, you could click those buttons and zoom into just areas or subjects of interest or disciplines. So the whole thing then starts to come alive. It's a little bit difficult to show you that on a flat slide, and we didn't want to end up firing up Excel spreadsheets and sort of disappearing down a rabbit hole. But we hope this visual illustrates the principle of being able to take fairly simple building blocks and then build them out make them quite complicated, but present them in a way that allows you to then get back into the detail and ask fairly specific questions. Quite often we find how people use these sheets is they'll click on a few buttons to find, if you like, the long bars or the big proportions. That will tip them off as to where maybe the priority should be, and then they can dive into the detail and actually arrive at a particular journal or subset of journals that might be of interest. Here we've illustrated a few ways of dicing and slicing things. So I've already mentioned the subject areas. We could expand or contract the number of years covered. Sometimes people want to have different time scales, and that's the panel at the bottom left. And then finally, top left, there's various other things we do behind the scenes that people are interested in. And one of them that we think is quite important is whether or not journals are published by a society or not. So behind the scenes, we've done quite a bit of work to classify data and differentiate between university presses, societies, and what we term other. So that would be your largely commercial publishers, maybe a few not-for-profits in there. And quite often that can be important because, especially if you are one of those sorts of publishers, you might want to compare like for like. If I am the Society of Cheese and Winemaking, I may want to compare myself with other society publishers, maybe the Society of Oenologists or the Society of Brie Makers, because that's important to me. And that's going to be meaningful comparing like for like. I might not, as a cheese and wine publisher, particularly need to compare myself, let's say, with somebody who's publishing in physics, just because those two disciplines may have a very different set of patterns and set of dynamics. So this first slide, I'm going to pause for a little bit of breath just in case there's any questions coming in as well. But I hope, just to wrap up, this gives you a sense of we can take journals, we can analyze patterns of uptake and output within them, and then wrap all that up into these visualizations that can then be clickable and interactive. So you can then zone in on the kind of questions and priorities that mean something for you when you're trying to look into decisions behind this. Laurie, you said there's a question.
So we've got just a reminder, if you have a question, to ask it in the Q&A, and we have a question in here. And this is regarding differentiator of hybrid and OA via transformative agreements. So if you want to talk a bit about that.
So for the sake of not giving everyone death by PowerPoint during this presentation, we haven't broken out every possible category. But yes, that's we have done some work when people have said, we want to know what are the patterns on transformative agreements, how much is the uptake happening, what journals might fall within them. And so, yes, we can do that. And we've even done things when we intersect things. So I think there was one project where a society came to us and said, well, how are societies doing within transformative agreements in our particular discipline? So we can intersect a number of these different ways of dicing and slicing things, and again, get to that, just that sort of sweet spot that's relevant to the person who's asking the question. So yes, absolutely. We haven't shown the transformative agreement breakout here, but that's something we can do with some caveats. We're only as good as the information, of course, that's out there. And I know transformative agreements are a bit of a movable feast. So it will depend on your location as a publisher and how much is actually going on in your space. But yes, that's a good question. Thanks for bringing that up.
And then also, understanding this is a sample set, but what is included generally in that public access bar, in that bronze set?
Good question. So take a step back. We found that people use, quote, open access to often mean one of two things. It can either mean open access as in what I would term the formal definition of it. So that is content that is both free of charge to read and free of reuse restrictions. So that's what I tend to term full fat open access. And that's quite often the definition that would be followed by Coalition S or the Wellcome Trust or those sorts of organizations. The other form of, quote, open, unquote, access is where content is free of charge to read, but is not necessarily reusable. So you can't necessarily take it away from a publisher's platform. And that we tend to term as public access. And I say to people, think OSTP, think the Holden and Nelson memos, where there may be other funders saying that we want publishers to make content available outside a paywall, but there's no dropping of copyright restrictions on that necessarily. So that public access, those brown bars, follow that second definition. And we think it's quite important to separate the two, the sort of full fat open access from public access, because they are addressed by different policies, and therefore they may affect different publishers and different consortia or libraries or different researchers differently, sort of depending on the funder and the policy in question. So I hope that that explains it. If you want any more detail, please just drop another question in the chat. And happy to go into that. One other thing I'll say on it is quite often you'll see headlines about, oh, half the world's content is now open access. And I do say to people, question what definition is being used, because that quote open access may include the public access bit. So it may resonate as a great headline with some people, but then for certain other funders, they may say, well, wait a minute, that's not quite what we mean. So always worth being aware of the definitions.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I think we can go on to the next.
Yep.
So
I just wanted to say really quickly that if you do want a one-on-one demonstration of the interactive version, we're happy to do that. That's not how we wanted to spend our time today. Is it okay to go to the next slide?
Yeah,
Dan?
yeah.
Okay.
So we've previously been looking, if you like, the big picture. Although we started with journals on the previous slide, I think, as I said, we can also apply that to the marketplace. Sometimes people say, well, we're publishing in cheesemaking. We're thinking about opening a cheesemaking journal. Well, what's happening with cheesemaking in general? What's the appetite? And that previous slide can handle that. Here we start to drill into what we term heat maps, and this is where you start to get a lot more detail about, so what will happen to my list of journals if certain things might change? What would happen if a particular policy came into effect? What might happen if there's a sudden uptake or change in the market? So we struggled a little bit with this because there's quite a few questions people could ask, but we wanted to alight on a specific example we hoped might resonate with people and have some grounding in the real world. So this is a fictitious heat map aimed at answering the question, what might happen to my journals if the new OSTP Nelson memo came into effect. So quick recap, we're talking about the US of A's Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. And I think famously a few years ago, they came out with a memo directing use of public access for the published results of federally funded research. And that was, I think, the so-called Holdren memo. And then in the summer of last year, the OSTP released a proposed update to that memo. I think proposed is the right word, with Alondra Nelson at the helm, so the so-called Nelson memo, and that, if you like, extended the net under which published research should be made public access. So it extended that memo to all federally funded research, not just research from the very large agencies, and it said it needs to be made public access with a 0-day embargo and so on and so forth. There's a number of other things. I refer you to the many other discussions about that, and I think we did a news and views on it. But the point is, if there's now a suddenly more robust funder mandate to make published output public access, so put it outside the paywall, if you are a publisher, or indeed if you are subscribing to publications, you might then say, well, what does that mean? Because all of a sudden a much greater degree of my publications fall under this mandate. Could it mean that people might start cancelling subscriptions, or there's no need for subscriptions? So how might that all work? So that's what this example is aimed at illustrating, how you might unpack a question like that. Now, as we said, this is just one example. This could be, instead of the Nelson memo, it could be about a number of other things. What might happen if Coalition S does something different, or transformative agreements go a different way, or et cetera, et cetera. And we'd be interested actually to find out from people the kinds of questions or unknowns that they're wrestling with. Do please make a note in the Q&A. Or let us panelists know. But as I said, this one is this specific example. How would we address what will happen to me if this particular policy landed. So the way we go about approaching this is we first need to sort of speak with the person we're doing the work for and get a list of basic data. So this would be a list of the publications, the journals, and here we're working with a fictitious publisher. So they're providing us the Annals of Cheesemaking, Biscuit Engineering Letters, and Oenology Reports. Again, we're in our food and wine area. And then we'll typically need a sense of where are we now? So how much stuff is being published, and maybe the kind of submissions that are coming in. So we'll then start to assemble columns of data that help us get a sense of how things are moving. And those are the columns across the top of the table. As I said, this is a very simple model for the sake of a demo. Quite often we can have lots of columns, but here, just to, I hope, illustrate the point, we're gathering some basic bibliometric information, how many papers are submitted, how much stuff is published. Then we can look at what's the current open access percentage, and that's that first colored columns. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 column from the left, but in the middle. And then I'll come on to the rest of it. But the first thing to note is one way we found very useful to help visualize data is to color code it in these heat maps. I do apologize for people who struggle with red-green differentiation. We can change the colors, of course, as needed. So I have to sort of put that little caveat and apology there. But at the moment, we're running with a simple sort of red, amber, green color coding. And the idea is if you look down a column, so let's look down that middle open access percentage column, just at a glance to get a sense of what's the big stuff, what's the small stuff. That's the whole point of the heat map. And it's a very quick way of attracting the eye to, if you like, the important things, or allowing you to set aside the less important things. So in that open access column, the highest percentage of open access uptake, about 8%, that's that red slice, I think 4 rows down. And then as the percentage of open access uptake grows, then we get more and more green. So that's where we are today. And then we said, right, well, now imagine if we dive behind the submissions for each of those journals, and then we have to take a look at the funders funding them, then we could get a sense of, okay, well, would those submissions fall under this new Nelson memo? And if they did, we have to assume that they then must go open. We could calculate a kind of theoretical what if would happen if that policy had come into effect today. So you can then get a sense of, compare with what we are currently doing, versus what might be a consequence of the policy, how might things differ? And that's what that 0.08% Nelson column, the second colored column, is showing. And sort of hardly surprisingly, if you've had quite a lot of open access uptake already, then the sort of relative proportions don't change. It just means you're probably finding more of it is falling under the auspices of the memo or the policy, whatever it is we're studying. And then what we can do is take that and then convert that into, what does that mean in terms of money? So if we look at the amount of revenue, this is for a publisher that's coming in for subscriptions, we can plot that out and color code it. And then finally, we can take a view of current open access revenue, color code that. And what we've done for the revenues is we started saying, well, let's put the highest subscription revenue at the top and sort the whole table based on that. So you can see the red subscription revenues at the top there. That's the stuff, if you like, that's most at risk, the highest amount of money coming in for subscriptions, working down the column. And then we can say, moving to second from the right, well, what might happen if you had to move that particular journal across to being fully open, because so much of it, or a sufficient proportion of it, is going to basically have to be made open anyway. You might as well flip the journal. So we can then come out with a theoretical model that says, based on where we are today, what might things look like tomorrow, and therefore will you be better or worse off? And that's the win-loss column at the right. So wrapping all that up, if you go across, say the first row, we're saying the Annals of Cheesemaking is clearly a really, really great subscription journal, gets a lot of subscriptions in it. But the trouble is, if you flipped it to open access, because it gets relatively little open access uptake, even under these new policies, you'll end up with 0.1 times the amount of revenue in an open access world compared with subscription world, or a 0.1x. That's what that means. So effectively, you'd only end up with 1/10 of your revenue if you were to flip that journal. However, as you start to work down the list, we may find towards the bottom right that you could end up making more money by flipping your journal to open access compared with where you were today with sort of relatively low subscription revenues. So the point of this table is journal by journal to get a sense of what might happen if this external event causes me to make a change in what I'm doing. Would I be better or worse off? And then the heat maps, the color coding allows you very rapidly to look at the red stuff. That's probably what's at risk. Green stuff, probably better, red stop, green go. And so at a glance, you can start to get a sense of where might I need to focus my priority, or where might I need to worry about something, and therefore might I have to take certain actions to address that. And again, this could apply if you are buying content, if you are a consortium or library representative. Really, then the value, instead of the revenue coming in for a journal, you might be analyzing cost of a particular journal or subscription or collection. So essentially, we're converting activity into money and allowing people to get a sense of where, as I said, the priorities might be and the big changes might be. So you can then focus on what's important rather than sort of getting overwhelmed by lists of hundreds of journals and not quite knowing where to start. As I said, this is sort of fictitious data. It has been inspired by real world projects. So what we try to do with the numbers is get you a sense of how real portfolios might actually work. So although I haven't made up a journal name for every row, we have found cases where you do get this sort of balancing act where you might have slightly lower subscriptions and quite healthy open access uptake, and then all of a sudden moving the journal from a subscription to a fully open journal actually does make sense, and you don't end up losing a huge amount of money, or indeed saving a huge amount of money if you were to shift subscriptions. So again, I'll pause there. I mean, that's quite a lot to take in. It's a complicated table. I hope I've broken it down and just explained it and give you a sense of how we have to go through gathering data, averaging it up, finding the kind of the relevant things that make sense, and then we can do this kind of before and after win-loss type analysis and color code it up so you can see it. Any other questions coming in, or Laurie?
Yeah,
anything?
Dan or Heather. So if we're working with a publisher to understand their particular holdings in this case and their scenario that applies for their specific journal portfolio, where would we, how would we start? What kind of information would we be gathering from the publisher? How would we create this type of modeling?
Yeah, I'll go first. Heather, please do leap in. So we'll first actually identify what's the question they're trying to answer, and that in turn often comes from, is there something that you're worried about out there? Quite often that would be a news-driven event. So in our case, the OSTP Nelson memo generated lots of column inches. It's about a year or so ago when it all came out. Then once we've determined the question, we can then back into or that will help tip us off of the kind of information we'll need, and then we'll sit down with the publisher and go through and say, okay, have your submission system, we might need to know submissions or published output is a typical one, and they will often be able to pull that from their systems. And then we might need to go into what proportion of your output falls under different categories. What's your open access output compared with your output subscriptions? That might involve, for example, pulling back hybrid journals. If you've got hybrid journals, what proportion are open versus under the subscription model? And then we might also need to get into background of individual paper submissions, so we can get a sense of funders. It might be geography of authors. That's another one that sometimes people ask us about. So quite often we need people to be able to go through their submission systems and get us data from that. Most submission systems will allow people to squirt out reports listing and summarizing this stuff. We'll also talk about timescales. So here we've just done a snapshot. We haven't really specified the timescales, but sometimes people might say, we want to know how things are changing over time, or we want to just take, let's say, a 3-year average or whatever. We can talk that through and really discuss with people what their kind of strategic views are and what kind of planning they're trying to make. That will often give a hint there. And then finally, with the revenue side of things, those often come from different systems. Quite often people have one system tracking the kind of editorial workflow and another system looking after the money. It may be 2 or 3 systems of each. It will depend on the size of the publisher. So again, we can sit down and say, right, if we need to figure out, in this case, whether you're going to be better or worse off, then we'll need to have a sense of, okay, how much money are you making under the different categories we're trying to analyze. So under here, it might be open access versus subscription. And we can then have conversations about the subtlety of methods. So sometimes we might talk about usage, which we haven't shown here, but sometimes people want to get a sense of, well, it's the heavily used journals that I'm more concerned about compared with ones that have less usage. And we also might need to talk about collections. We'll come on to an example of the kind of output of that from the next slide. But sometimes people might say, well, if we'll bundle journals together. And again, that could be for selling them, it could be for buying them. What happens if there's one really kind of blue ribbon journal, and if that comes out of the collection because it's gone to a different business model, then all of a sudden people just won't be interested in the whole collection. So we'll sometimes have conversations about that kind of structure. And how things are grouped together and sold in bundles, and that might also help us to get a sense of the information used.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add, Dan mentioned usage, impact factor, maybe another way that just for easy viewing purposes, you may want to organize things. We can take into consideration if you have a internal transfer or cascade system, how changes with one journal might in turn affect the others, and kind of feeding back, and how different, if you're an APC model, how different APC models play into that. Another thing that has come up in some projects is, the number of institutional subscribers, because if you're thinking about moving, for example, to a subscribe to open model, you may want to know what types of resource requirements might come with shifting your sales force or your communications around an additional model, and how that might play out internally. So it can get into the sort of dozens, if not more, of columns. So.
And basically customized for
Yes.
the publisher's needs.
All
right, I'm conscious.
Sorry, Laurie, just to cut in on that, that customized just triggered a thought to me. That's the point of this. We're showing just one example, but I hope people listening, if they're still following through all these spreadsheets, to use your imagination. Think, well, okay, I may not necessarily have need for those specific columns, but if I'm answering a question, what we can do is customize these sheets and drop in the columns that will make sense for a particular project. And the general principle then is this color coding and the comparing of different sort of like before and after. I think that's where the power of tools like this come in. There is quite a lot of heavy lifting to do behind the scenes to wrap everything up, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, do we want to go through this slide? We've got I am conscious of the time, and we want to make sure that we get to the
absolutely. So I mean, really, this almost is the payoff. So I've done all the homework now. We've been looking at journal by journal models in the previous slide. Quite often you need to start with that level of detail, maybe even more. That previous slide in terms of summarizing stuff. But usually where people are trying to head is, well, so what's the big picture? For example, at the top, they may say, well, okay, we need to build all the data journal by journal, but we actually want to know what this means for different collections or disciplines. So here, if we're dealing with a medical publisher, they might want to think about, well, okay, is my nursing list different to my medicine physician list, different to my dentist or vet? Here in our fictitious example, within food sciences, we're saying, well, you might want to differentiate between cheese making, biscuit making, and wine making, each of which may have several journals below it, but you're just trying to wrap all that up. And particularly if people are selling and buying collections that are organized by discipline, that kind of table at the top is quite important, because it can then say, well, overall, do we stand to, what's the most heavily used group of journals for particular business model or uptake or whatever it might be. So here we're saying that it's clearly that cheese making seems to be a lot more open access than biscuits, which have relatively low uptake, and so on. The middle table is then another variant on this heat map idea, because quite often you're saying, well, okay, now we understand the lay of the land. Is there some sweet spot? So, for example, is there a level of subscription revenue above which we just want to leave stuff well alone because there's just like a little bit too much to lose, but below which actually might make sense for us to flip. And then similarly, sort of reading left to right, is there a threshold of open access uptake? You know, a journal or group of journals with very, very little open access uptake, it just may not be economically viable to consider making that open access. But as you have more and more and more of your articles open access, then all of a sudden that balance shifts. So the idea of that table in the middle is to run a bunch of sort of what if scenarios, big spreadsheet behind the scenes, and then bring it all together into a nice little heat map. And again, you want to leave the red bits alone and go with the green bits. That's the idea of all this. So people can then very clearly get a sense of at what point above which thresholds might I need to take a decision or do something differently. And again, we would tailor that for the particular project in question. And then finally, at the bottom visual is really just to make a point that these things can get even more complicated than I've been through, in the sense there can be many moving parts. So in the very first slide, we talked about that difference between uptake within a journal and how big the journal was. You can apply that to a collection. You can apply that to uptake out there of just research papers generated in general. But quite often you need a way of sort of balancing how much. So we need to focus on the big stuff, but also the kind of the heat map, how important is it? And this is just another way, that table at the bottom, of bringing together a few things. And we've done a few projects where we've actually tried to develop like a scoring system. So people are saying, look, there's all these moving parts. I still don't quite know whether I need to focus on my cheese making or my wine list. And we can try and boil that down to some simple scores based on a number of factors and just say, basically, if the score gets higher, the chances are that's the area you need to focus on, and maybe you want to prioritize moving open in those areas first. But if it's a lower score, then maybe not. And so I wanted to make the point, there's a variety of ways of presenting multi-dimensional information in what is basically a flat two-dimensional presentation, which is quite often how you end up delivering these things. So we can come up with scoring systems to help people get to where they want to go. Similarly, again, for the buyers, libraries, consortia, you might run similar exercises saying, where do we think the costs might really lie, or are there particular big or collections we might need to focus on, and can we set aside the smaller ones because they may not have a huge effect on budgets or some other sorts of decisions we might be taking. So this lot it's all about wrapping up the individual line items to different scoreboards. And again, when we work with people, we'll often talk about, based on what questions you're trying to answer, what kind of presentation might work for you. And we can suggest 2 or 3 different ideas. And I think we find often that people are light on one and they go, okay, yeah, that's the one that makes sense for me. And we can sit down and talk about it. So we find it's a very interactive process of putting these things together.
All right, so we want to be able to talk about the affordability calculator as well. So if we want to move on to that for a few minutes now.
So affordability, this taking a step back, why did we start doing this? Well, I think affordability, as most people, I guess, on the call are aware of, has now become a topic. The original trigger, I think, was affordability of an APC-based model, sort of per paper article processing charge-based model. I want to attach a big caveat. That was the starting point. But in our view, affordability can apply whatever your business model. If there is a paywall, if somebody's got to pay for something, then of course affordability might be an issue. So we wanted to dig into this and build on some of these heat maps and tools and ways of thinking about data to see if we could just pull apart what might happen behind that. So this map here is illustrating, if you like, the general concept of what is affordability. And here we start to get into a bit of an economics lesson, but it's all right. It gets quite fun because you get into Bergonomics and the Big Mac Index, which always make me laugh. But essentially, what we find, particularly in the scholarly publishing marketplace, is people tend to set their prices in one currency. So largely that means my APCs or subscriptions or whatever, insert your business model here, are charging in dollars. It's X dollars per journal or per collection or per whatever. And you will pay that dollar amount wherever you are located in the world. And of course, the unwritten assumption, as it were, is, well, of course, well, if I'm in, I don't know, Brazil, I'm existing in Brazilian real, then I'll just go through the exchange rate, real to US dollars, and kind of everything will work itself out. But in actual fact, what economists have found is that currency exchange rates don't necessarily reflect what really is going on and how really affordable something is. And the example of that is the Big Mac index, where you could take a product that is pretty uniform and available in pretty well every country in the world and say, if you're in Brazil, a Big Mac will cost you the local equivalent of about $4.44. This is a couple of years ago. In the US, it would be about $5.70 at that same time. But in Switzerland, it would cost you in Swiss francs the equivalent of about $7.50 US. So in other words, the dollar amount you're paying when things are priced in sort of local value is not quite the same as if you simply set the thing in dollars across the whole world. And if you set, let's say, a Big Mac in dollars across the whole world at that time, in America, it'd be whatever it was, about $5.50. But if you're Swiss, you think, well, hey, that's cheap. I'm expected to pay near the equivalent of $7. But if you're in Brazil, it starts to get quite expensive. So the point is that currency exchange rates don't necessarily reflect affordability. The Big Mac index was almost like a humorous attempt at explaining this, put out by The Economist magazine. I think it was the 80s, I think they did it, but they used that just to make the point. You need sort of something that's fairly uniform across the world and pulls in a number of different local activities so you can get these affordability measures. I like the Big Mac index because for me, it kind of makes sense. I can picture people going to a conference and having sort of bought dollar equivalents for the same meal. But in actual fact, when you talk about affordability, organizations like the World Bank and the OECD, they've done a much, much more sophisticated job of trying to figure out how do you compare affordability between different countries. And they use something called purchasing power parity, PPP, where they've taken a much more complicated basket of goods and services and figured out relative affordability. And that's what this map is showing. It's basically saying, if you just set something in a dollar amount, how affordable is it as you move around the world? And I'm using US dollars not to pick on America, just because US dollars is such a sort of commonly used currency. This would work for euros. It probably work for British pounds, Swiss francs, but anything that's coming out of those kind of stronger currencies. But essentially on the map, the darker the color, the less affordable something is if it's simply priced in US dollars. So this map is really tipping us off to say, the discussion about affordability, I think, certainly has evidentiary basis, and you can start to quantify it based on these sort of PPP, these affordability type models. So hardly surprisingly, for US dollars, very faint on the top left in the US, that's the kind of baseline. Move to South America, the map gets darker and things become less affordable. And then similarly, as you then move east into Africa and into Asia and so on. One of the things a bit surprising is that areas of Europe, quite small on the map, they're getting slightly dark. So even areas that perhaps we think of as being quite wealthy don't necessarily find things sort of 100% affordable. So this map was a sense of what's affordability and how might it vary around the world. And then we moved to the next slide. We did some modeling and said, we did this based on average article processing charges, but as I said, you can run this out for any. It really doesn't matter where you put the pay booth. We could run this out for subscriptions. We basically said, well, okay, if you're pricing in US dollars, but really wanted to address the issue of affordability, so go back to that map and basically sort of reduce prices for people in countries where the dollar is less affordable. How might your prices change? How should you change your prices to make them more affordable based on the individual location? So this is getting us away from simply pricing in dollars, and rather it's now saying let's charge based on what people can pay, based on the economic evidence, based on the work that people like the World Bank have done. And we came out with this because that was one of the ideas put forward in some of the discussions about affordability that I think people like OASPA and Coalition S and so forth are working on. And what we found was, it's quite interesting. So basically, we haven't shown every country in the world in this chart. What this chart is showing is this classic box and whisker plot, if you're familiar with that. Each bar is a territory, an area, and we've just picked a few arbitrary ones. So we got a sort of like for like comparison. And then within each area, we have one dot per country, which you can sort of see on the bars. And then the idea of the bars is they show you sort of the maximum and minimum variation. That's the sort of the T shape at the top and bottom at the end of the whiskers in most of the bars. And then the rectangle is basically where, if you like, the center of the bell curve is. It's where within one standard deviation, if that makes sense. But that's sort of where the, if you like, the meat of the average sits. Trying not to get too technical, so you can get a sense of how much things spread out and how condensed they are. So, for example, in America, in the North America, there was only about 3 countries there. I think that's the US, Canada, and I believe the Bahamas is sitting in that one. We're going off World Bank classifications in terms of region, and so the horizontal line across the middle of the box, that shows you where the sort of the median is, the sort of bang on middle average is. And so for that box top left, North America, the US is sitting right on the that's the US wouldn't have to change its prices if we measure affordability relative to the US dollar. However, it could argue, if you're pricing in US dollars, you could arguably put your prices up if you're selling to a very wealthy area of the world, such as the Bahamas, but you might want to reduce them slightly if you're selling into perhaps somewhere like Canada, which isn't quite the economic powerhouse of the US. So that's what this plot's trying to tell us. For a given group of countries, how might we want to shift prices up and down? What I find interesting is we start to work across the chart. The European Union, which of course I think most people would say, well, that's a very wealthy area of the world in relative terms. In actual fact, when you price in US dollars, very, very few countries, in fact, pretty well all countries would need to pay a little bit less. Remember, Switzerland's not inside the European Union, so I can't refer back to my Switzerland example. But in actual fact, even countries operating in euros or pound sterling or whatever might find US dollar pricing slightly less affordable than the simple currency exchange rates might suggest. And then we can move across the 2 middle groups, the Research for Life groups. So people are familiar with them. They organize countries into 2 groups. I think Group A are where they recommend publishers completely waive fees. So the very low income countries is defined by the World Bank. And secondly, I think there's the Group B where Research for Life recommend reduced charges. And again, we can see some interesting stuff that sort of some of the Research for Life countries that recommend completely zero charges are actually, in this model, seem to be able to afford prices in US dollars more than some countries in Europe. You look at that Research for Life box, and there's stuff that's right up there near the axis, near the horizontal axis. And then finally, as we move across to the high, middle, and low income countries, these are World Bank classifications. And again, we just wanted to get a sense of how they fell. So, of course, highly surprisingly, that high income country, you'll find a few dots above the horizontal axis. So you could argue, well, they're the wealthy countries, perhaps you might put prices up for them, but then you might reduce prices in other countries, even ones, again, that might be in the high income group. So it's quite a rich data set. And the point of all this is, in order to produce this chart, we can then work with people to say, well, if you were interested in looking at your pricing models, we could take your particular pricing and we could run it through the tools that we use to generate this and get a sense of how you might derive a discount policy based on these economic indicators. So you might, if you really wanted to charge different prices in different countries, we could work with you to figure out exactly what those prices would be, how much of a discount you might produce off your list prices, and therefore what that overall effect might be. One final thing I will say is these were based off list prices. As a general rule of thumb, we'll say to people, assume when you're sort of doing back of envelope calculations, assume on average there's about 15% discount by the time you bundle in the sort of discounts that people already offer. But still, that would only move, that wouldn't really make a huge difference to the chart. But as I said, I hope this has given you a quick introduction, notions of what affordability is, the fact that it's not simply about exchange rate, the fact that we're an unusual ecosystem, and the fact we tend to peg things based on usually one currency, irregardless of where the buyer is located. And then finally, we can actually do some evidence-based and quant-based work to change that if people were interested in exploring how those different models might look, or how much they think they should pay. Indeed, as I said, these things do work whether you are buying or selling. I will pause for breath there. I'm cautious we've got just a few minutes to go.
Yeah, we're just about at time. Thank you for that, Dan. Heather, anything you want to add before we?
I just want to again point folks to the news and views from August and September, which go through in more detail and have some of the points that Dan highlighted. There was a lot going on here between these two topic areas, and if you want to see the interactive versions, we're happy to set up a one-to-one call to tell you more about that.
All right, great. Well, thank you both. That is a wrap for our session today. Thanks to Heather and Dan and all of you for joining us today. We'll share the recorded version on our website in a few days, and you'll receive notification when that's available in case you want to listen again or share with your colleagues. As Heather mentioned, don't miss our market sizing update, October 25th at 10 o'clock Eastern time. The link is in the chat. And if anything more occurs to you, please reach out. We'll also be at many events in the next couple of months, including SSP New Directions next week, STM Frankfurt and the Frankfurt Book Fair in October, Charleston in November, to name a few. So please reach out if you'd like to schedule time for either a Zoom call or an in-person meeting. And thanks again to everyone and our speakers today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.